I want to tell you about a story that happened to me several years ago. I was a college student when this strange thing happened to me. I enrolled in a course. Well, it doesn't matter. At first, everything was not even bad. It was nice to study. I made, as I thought then, friends and acquaintances. The building was two-story, with a beautifully decorated area in front of the building itself. But still, something was strange. Something that I could not understand. Until that fateful day. One day I stayed after classes to finish my independent work. After a long time of work, I finally decided to hand in the paper, when suddenly I saw a strange shadow on the board in front of me. To say that I was scared then is to say nothing. I was so scared that I was ready to run from the office without looking back. Having pulled myself together and decided to see who this silhouette could belong to, I turned around abruptly and realized that no one was there. Then, having definitely decided to run from the office, I put down the work and flew out of the classroom. I would have continued running towards the exit and further, but the students. They were still in the college. 40 minutes had passed since the bell rang, but all the students were there. They weren't moving. Their faces were emotionless. It felt like I was in a wax figure house and was now looking at statues. I started to approach and ask, what happened? But no one answered me. Everyone continued to stand and look into space. I ran as fast as I could, just to get out of this place as quickly as possible, and ran further if I hadn't bumped into an old man. It was a very old man, hunched over and so thin, as if he hadn't eaten for a long time. He was dressed in an old security guard uniform. He stood up, began to examine me, and suddenly said in a hoarse voice, "We haven't had anyone like you here for a long time." "What do you mean, like me?" I asked. I never got an answer to my question. He just grinned and turned to the window. After some time, the old man began his story. I will not quote him, since 10 years have passed and I have forgotten much of this story. I only remember that he told about a fire that happened in the college 20 years ago. That no one survived the incident except him. Since he had nowhere to live, he stayed in the college, and there he died of hunger. Having finished his story, the guard laughed and disappeared. Here the building changed. From new, beautiful, and clean, it turned into an ominous structure, with broken glass, charred wood, and walls blackened with soot. The metal doors were rusty, and all the equipment in the offices had long been in poor condition and did not work. I ran into the storage room, and among a pile of ash, finding my documents, hurried to get out of this place. I am already 27 years old. Sometimes at night I see a dream about this college. In this nightmare, the security guard asks to come to this educational institution again. To be honest, I wanted to go back there. But still, when I arrived there, I found a vacant lot on the site of the college. In 2007, I entered the first year. We were placed in an old dormitory. Now it has been renovated, clean and tidy. But back then, rats, cockroaches, and bedbugs were walking around in droves. The wiring was sparking. The plaster was falling off. The wind was blowing through all the cracks, and 6 people were being crammed into rooms designed for 2. But it was still a fun and carefree time. Once the residents of our room and the 2 neighboring rooms gathered for an evening get-together. We didn't have any alcohol, pills, grass, or mushrooms. For such things, you'd be evicted in no time. We just lit a couple of candles to create the right atmosphere and started telling scary stories one after another, including about our dorm. They say that a year ago in room 526, the girls were summoning spirits. They couldn't cope with the ritual, and what they summoned got out of control, caused a terrible pogrom, and has been wandering around restlessly ever since. And the room itself became cursed, and no one stays there for long, except that there were no murders there. And the dormitory itself, they say, stands on bones. It was built on the site of a mass grave of victims of political repression, and groans are heard from the basement every now and then. Aha! And the ghost of a forgotten sanitary pad flies along the corridor of the women's shower and sucks the blood of gaping victims, someone from the audience said skeptically. Nonsense, of course, but we were all afraid of the women's shower, especially in the evenings. The men's shower was in another wing of the basement. and did not cause any unnecessary emotions. But the women's. There was some kind of oppressive atmosphere there, the reasons for which we could only guess. It seemed like nothing special, old cracked tiles, cubicles with partitions. Everything was clean, almost sterile, but to go there alone, God forbid. Only in a noisy company. Well, we then assumed that women are evil creatures by nature. They wash off all the negativity and leave it in the shower, and this is what puts pressure on the psyche. In general, we chatted and parted, and a month later our room misbehaved and we were sentenced to work. As punishment, we had to wash the stairs in the women's shower, and after it closed at 12 o'clock at night. We spent a long time fiddling with the stairs. After all, there are 5 floors, and we ended up in the shower somewhere around 3 o'clock. It was a separate section in the basement. To get there, you had to open a metal door. There was a long, dark, windowless corridor behind it, and you had to walk through it to turn on the lights in the corridor, the locker room, and the shower. One of us stayed at the door to keep watch, and the 3 of us went to the switchboard, rattling an empty bucket. Almost immediately, I noticed a strange cold and musty smell. "Where is the cold coming from?" "That's the steam room," flashed through my mind. And then the switch clicked and we started screaming. The entire shower was covered in blood. There were splashes even on the ceiling, on the floor, on the walls. And where the drain hole was in the floor, some thick slime with hair was squirming, or maybe it was thin worms, we couldn't tell. I don't remember how we ran to the commandant's room. We pounded on the door and shouted, interrupting each other. They raised the guard, called the police. But the detectives arrived only in the morning and found nothing. The shower was clean. No smell, no traces, nothing. The commandant was fined for a false call. But the hostel was full of rumors. The staff whispered in the corners. That's how we learned that a month ago a pregnant girl, a cleaner, hanged herself in this shower, also at night. Her replacement found her in the morning, already cold. Then we all remembered that the shower and the stairs were really closed for quarantine, and for a whole week we were forced to go through the back door and wash in the sports complex. Of course, the incident was forgotten. The deceased was an illegal immigrant. To somehow distract myself from all these horrors, I immersed myself in my studies, signed up for evening English courses, and even got a job as a salesperson in a supermarket. I slept 3-4 hours a day, and not soundly. I was tormented by nightmares. And then one day I had to return from work after midnight. The hostel had long since passed lights out. The corridors were silent, and I had to pass by that ill-fated door into the creepy compartment. Due to the late hour, the entrance to the shower was already closed. As I walked along the corridor, I heard footsteps from behind the shower door. Was someone locked in there? As soon as I started thinking about it, I was hit by an icy draft, and something heavy hit the door from the other side. I rushed up the stairs screaming, and something was raging and howling below. Surprisingly, this time there was physical evidence left. Scratches on the inside of the door, as if from claws, and a bent lock shackle. 2 days later, I was no longer in that dorm. Ignoring the impressive deposit paid for accommodation, I packed my things and ran away to a classmate in a rented apartment. And much later, I found out that the dormitory commandant had fallen ill with cancer. One of my former roommates had ended up in a psychiatric hospital with a nervous disorder. Another had suddenly dropped out of school in the middle of the year and gone to a monastery. And a third was wasting away from an incomprehensible illness that no doctor could diagnose.
When I was a young student and first started earning enough to live alone, that is, to spend money on rent and food, I left my parents and rented an apartment in an old house on the outskirts. The apartment was on the first floor, covered in graffiti, basically a den where some girl had lived before me. I rented this den naturally because I had no money, not because of my apartment preferences, and it was closer to the university. When I moved in, and this girl accordingly moved out, she looked at me and sarcastically told me to get ready. What to get ready for, I didn't understand then. The apartment itself consisted of a hallway, a kitchen, an abandoned room, and my room. The kitchen had a huge window, decorated with torn and yellowed curtains, a peeling ceiling, graffiti on the walls. The abandoned room, as my neighbor later told me, belonged to someone's grandmother who had died, was furnished with unnecessary furniture from other rooms and an old radio built into the wall. My room is the largest and generally unremarkable, a little cozier than the others, but with the same inscriptions on the walls. On the first day, having moved all my things and connected the computer, I settled down to sleep completely alone in my room, when I suddenly noticed that music was coming from the neighboring empty room with old things. Old music, without words. The time was around 1 in the morning. To be honest, I was scared to death. I lay, pressed into the bed, not daring to move for about 20 minutes, and tried to convince myself that it was the neighbors, that I was imagining it. But the more I listened, the more I realized that the music was coming from there. Covered in a cold sweat, I took my butterfly knife out of my backpack and went into the hallway, turning on the light in the hallway and in my room along the way. In front of me was a closed white door into an empty room. Gathering my courage, I burst into the room shouting, "Get out of my apartment!" But there was no one there. Only the radio was playing, having somehow turned on by itself. Having calmed down a bit, I unplugged the radio, locked the room tightly, and went to bed. I think I don't need to say that I spent the night with my eyes open, looking towards the corridor with a knife under my pillow. The next day, everything seemed to be in order. I went to university first, then to work. In the evening, I came home, sat at the computer, and started studying. I had to do some lab work on cryptography, I think. Anyway, having finished my work, I sat until 1 o'clock, specifically listening. I laughed at myself. How can the radio play if I unplugged it? And yesterday, probably, something just broke in it, and that's why it started playing. I went to bed, but I felt a little uneasy, and I couldn't fall asleep until 3 in the morning. And then it started. The same music was playing again from the same room. Then I rushed to the front door of my room, propped it up with a stool and barricaded it with a nightstand. I spent the second night sitting opposite the door and thinking that I was going crazy. The music was quite loud. It was clear that it was coming from the next room, and not from the neighbors. The music stopped after half an hour, and the next morning I went in and specially checked. The radio was unplugged. I had nowhere to leave the apartment. I had a fight with my parents when I left, and I had no friends who could shelter me. The third night was the same, but I was almost not afraid anymore, and the music did not last long. It seemed to me about 5 minutes. Of course, I didn't dare go into the room. On the fourth day, everything ended, and a month and a half later, having found a new place to live, I moved out of this apartment.